Bible stories. Mo, David, Daniel, Jesus, Noah. Welcome to my channel.
The fire burned low that night, casting long trembling shadows across the rough stones where Jephthah stood alone. His breath slow but heavy, as though every inhale carried the weight of a life that had never truly belonged anywhere. He was not born into honor, not raised among the respected, not remembered with pride by those who shared his blood. He was the son of a prostitute, a man whose very existence had been rejected before he ever had the chance to prove his worth, cast out by his own brothers who refused to share their inheritance with someone they believed should never have existed in the first place. So he left, or perhaps more truthfully, he was driven away, forced into a land where survival depended not on kindness or righteousness but on strength, cunning, and the willingness to stand beside men who had nothing left to lose. There, in the wilderness, he became something else entirely, a leader of outcasts, a warrior shaped not by law but by conflict, a man who understood violence more intimately than peace. And yet even in that life of exile, there remained something unresolved deep within him, a quiet hunger, not just for survival but for recognition, for meaning, for a place in a story greater than his own rejection. And when the elders of Israel came to him, their voices carrying the desperation of a people cornered by war, begging him to return and lead them against the Ammonites, the irony must have been impossible to ignore. The same men who once allowed him to be cast aside now kneeling before him, asking for salvation, offering him authority, promising him a position he had never been allowed to hold. He did not accept immediately, not because he doubted his ability, but because he understood the cost of trust. Understood that people who abandon you once can do it again, and yet the offer stirred something powerful inside him, something dangerous, the chance not only to fight but to finally belong, to step out of the shadows of rejection and into a role that demanded respect. So he made them swear, made them promise that if he led them to victory, he would become their head, their leader, their judge, and when they agreed, he returned with them, not as the outcast they had banished, but as the man they now depended on. The battlefield awaited, but before the first sword was drawn, before the first cry of war echoed across the land, Jephthah did something that would define his legacy in a way no victory ever could. He turned his attention not to his soldiers, not to strategy, but to God. And in the stillness before the storm, he spoke words that should never have been spoken, words that rose from a place of desperation mixed with belief. A dangerous combination that can lead a man to convince himself that anything offered in the name of faith must be righteous. He made a vow, not quietly, not carelessly, but with intention, lifting his voice as though the heavens themselves were listening, saying that if God would grant him victory over the Ammonites, then whatever came out of the doors of his house to meet him when he returned would be offered as a burnt offering. It was a statement wrapped in confidence, perhaps even pride, as though he believed the gesture would secure divine favor, as though the magnitude of the sacrifice would prove his devotion beyond question. And yet beneath those words lay something far more fragile. A man who had spent his entire life trying to prove that he was worth something, now attempting to secure victory by offering something he assumed he could control. He did not pause to consider what might actually come out of his house. He did not question the weight of what he had promised. He did not ask for clarification, for mercy, for wisdom. He simply spoke, and in doing so bound himself to a future he did not yet understand. And then the silence came. There was no thunder, no voice from heaven, no sign of approval or warning. God did not interrupt him. God did not correct him. The vow hung in the air, unanswered, and perhaps that silence was mistaken for acceptance. Perhaps Jephthah believed that because he was not stopped, he was justified, and with that belief secured in his mind, he went to war. The battle was fierce, as all battles are, filled with chaos and fear, and the desperate will to survive. But Jephthah was no stranger to conflict, no stranger to leading men who fought like they had nothing left to lose, and under his command, Israel did the unthinkable. They won, not just a narrow escape but a decisive victory that shattered the enemy and secured peace, at least for a time. The cries of war were replaced with the sounds of celebration, the clash of weapons replaced with the relief of survival. And Jephthah stood among the victorious, not just as a warrior but as a leader, a man who had done what he was called to do, who had proven his worth not just to the people who once rejected him but to himself. He was returning home not as an outcast but as a conqueror, a man whose name would now be spoken with respect instead of contempt. And perhaps in that moment, as he made his way back, he allowed himself to feel something he had never truly experienced before, a sense of belonging, of fulfillment, of having finally stepped into the place he had always been denied. But as he approached his house, as the distance between victory and home grew smaller, something shifted, something subtle at first, a movement at the doorway, a figure emerging with energy and joy, and then suddenly, everything slowed. It was not a servant, it was not an animal, it was not something distant or expendable. It was his daughter, his only child. She came out dancing, her steps light, her face filled with happiness, celebrating the return of her father, unaware that her presence in that moment was the very thing that would destroy them both. Time did not just slow, it fractured, because in that instant, two realities collided, her joy and his horror, her celebration and his realization, and the weight of his vow came crashing down with a force far greater than any enemy he had faced on the battlefield. He tore his clothes, a physical expression of a pain that words could not contain, crying out not in anger at God but in anguish at himself, saying that she had brought him very low, that she had become the cause of his trouble, but the truth was far more devastating. She was not the cause. She was the consequence, the living, breathing consequence of a promise he had made without understanding its cost. She looked at him, confused, searching his face for an explanation, for some sign that this was still a moment of joy. But what she found instead was grief, deep and unrelenting, and when he told her, when he spoke the words of the vow, when he revealed what he had promised to do, the world as she knew it must have shifted in an instant. The safety of home replaced by the reality of sacrifice. And yet, what followed was not rebellion, not rage, not an attempt to escape, but something far more unsettling. She accepted it. She told her father to do as he had vowed, to fulfill the promise he had made to God, but she asked for one thing. Just 2 months to go into the mountains with her friends and mourn. Not her death, but her life, the future she would never have, the family she would never build, the existence that would end before it had truly begun. And Jephthah, bound by his own words, agreed. She left, and for 2 months she wandered the hills, grieving a life that had been taken from her not by war, not by illness, but by a vow spoken in a moment of desperate faith. There is no record of what those days looked like, no detailed account of her thoughts, her fears, her questions. But it is impossible not to imagine the silence. The weight of knowing that each sunrise brought her closer to an end she did not choose. And when the time was over, when the 2 months had passed, she returned, not because she had to, but because she chose to, because she believed that her father's word to God was something that could not be broken, even if it cost her everything. And then, the final silence. No angel came to stop it. No voice intervened. No last-minute salvation changed the outcome. The story does not linger on the act itself, perhaps because the implication is already too heavy, too unbearable to fully describe, but it tells us enough to understand that Jephthah did as he had vowed. Victory had been given, the promise had been made, and the price was paid. And in the end, the most haunting part of the story is not just the sacrifice itself, but the silence that surrounded it, the absence of intervention, the reality that a man believed he was honoring God, and in doing so, destroyed the very thing he loved most, leaving behind a question that has never truly been answered. What happens when faith, unchecked and unquestioned, leads a person not to righteousness, but to tragedy? There are moments in human history when silence becomes louder than any voice, when the absence of intervention feels heavier than judgment itself. And what makes the story of Jephthah and his daughter so deeply unsettling is not only the vow that was made or the life that was taken, but the unbearable stillness that surrounded it. A silence that did not break even as a father walked step by step toward fulfilling a promise that should never have been spoken. When his daughter returned from the mountains, there was no celebration waiting for her, no hidden rescue, no sudden change of fate waiting behind the doors of her home. Only the quiet understanding that the time she had asked for had come to an end, and that the path before her led to a conclusion she had already accepted. And perhaps that acceptance is what disturbs the human heart the most. Because we expect resistance in the face of death. We expect fear, anger, desperation, something that feels like life fighting to remain alive. But instead what we are given is a young woman who walks back toward her father with a calm that feels almost unnatural, as though she had already crossed the line between hope and surrender long before her feet carried her home. Jephthah stood there watching her approach, and there are no words recorded of what he said in that moment. No detailed exchange preserved for us to analyze or understand, only the outcome. Only the knowledge that he did what he had vowed. And yet if we allow ourselves to sit in that moment, to truly imagine what it must have been like, the weight becomes almost unbearable. Because this was not a distant act carried out in abstraction. This was a father standing before his child, a man who had fought and bled and survived countless battles, now facing something far more devastating than any enemy he had ever encountered, the consequence of his own words. The fire that would consume her was not just a physical flame but the visible manifestation of a decision made in haste, a vow spoken without wisdom, and as the moment unfolded there was still no interruption, no voice calling out from heaven as had happened in other stories, no last-second command to stop, no divine hand reaching down to intervene. And that absence forces a question that echoes through generations. Why was there silence here when there had been intervention elsewhere? Why did no one step in to stop a father from carrying out something so final, so irreversible? Some have argued that the silence itself was the lesson, that Jephthah's vow was never commanded by God and therefore the responsibility remained entirely his. That the tragedy was not an act of obedience but a result of misunderstanding. A reflection of a man shaped by a culture where vows and sacrifices were often intertwined. A man who believed that the greater the offering, the greater the favor he would receive, and in that belief he crossed a line he did not even realize existed. But even if that is true, it does not make the moment easier to bear. Because the silence still remains, the stillness that allowed the act to reach its completion without interruption. His daughter, whose name is never recorded, whose identity is forever tied to the vow that took her life, becomes one of the most haunting figures in all of Scripture precisely because she is so human and yet so quiet. Her story does not explode with dramatic resistance or rebellion. It settles into a heavy, lingering grief that feels almost too real, too close, because it reflects something deeply uncomfortable about human nature, the ability to accept things that should never be accepted when they are framed as unavoidable, as necessary, as part of something larger than ourselves. And yet, even in her acceptance, there is something profound, something that forces us to pause, because her request to mourn was not centered on death itself but on the life she would never live, the relationships she would never have, the future that would never unfold. And in that detail we see a glimpse of what was truly lost. Not just a single moment, but an entire story that ended before it had the chance to begin. The mountains where she wandered for 2 months become a kind of silent witness, a place where grief was allowed to exist without interruption, where she could process what was coming in a way that no one else could fully understand, surrounded by friends who could only watch as time moved forward, knowing that there was nothing they could do to change the outcome. And when she returned, there was no resistance recorded, no attempt to escape, and that absence of struggle leaves a void that is almost impossible to fill, because it removes the sense of chaos we often associate with tragedy and replaces it with something far more unsettling, a quiet, deliberate movement toward an ending that feels inevitable. Jephthah, who had once stood before God with confidence, now stood before the consequence of his own words, and it is difficult to imagine that the same certainty remained within him because the cost had become real, tangible, undeniable, and yet he moved forward, not because it was easy, not because it was right, but because he believed he had no other choice, that breaking his vow would somehow be worse than fulfilling it, that his integrity before God depended on completing what he had started, even if it meant losing everything that mattered most. This belief, this rigid adherence to a promise made in a moment of desperation, reveals something deeply human, the tendency to cling to decisions even when they lead us toward destruction, simply because we cannot bear the thought of admitting that we were wrong, that we spoke too quickly, that we acted without understanding. And so the act was carried out, And the story closes not with resolution but with a tradition, a note that the daughters of Israel would go out year after year to remember her, to commemorate the life that was lost. And in that remembrance, we see that the impact of the event extended far beyond the moment itself. It became something that lingered, something that shaped memory and identity, something that refused to be forgotten even if it was never fully explained. The silence from heaven did not mean the absence of consequence, and perhaps that is one of the most difficult truths to accept. That not every tragedy is interrupted, that not every wrong is immediately corrected, that sometimes the weight of human decisions is allowed to unfold completely, leaving behind questions that do not have easy answers. And as the story settles into its ending, it does not offer comfort. It does not attempt to resolve the tension or explain away the pain. It simply leaves us with the reality of what happened: a father who made a vow, a daughter who paid the price, and a silence that continues to echo long after the flames have died out. But this was not the only story where grief lingered in the open, where loss was not hidden away but exposed for all to see, because elsewhere, under a different sky, another figure would refuse to leave what others had abandoned, and her quiet defiance would speak louder than any vow ever could. The bodies were left in the open, and that was the point. They were not buried with dignity, not covered, not mourned in the way the dead are meant to be remembered. They were displayed, exposed to the sky, to the heat of the sun and the cold of the night, hanging as a warning to anyone who might dare to forget what had been done or why it had been done. This was not just death, it was a message, a statement written not in ink but in flesh, meant to linger, meant to be seen, meant to instill fear. Days passed, and no one came. The people saw them, surely, passing by at a distance, avoiding the place, pretending not to notice, because to look too long was to acknowledge something unbearable, something that demanded a response no one was willing to give. The wind moved through the land, carrying with it the quiet decay of what had once been living, and still no one came. No burial, no prayers, no closure, just silence, stretching across time, as if the world itself had decided to turn away. But one person did not turn away. Her name was Ritzpah, and she had every reason to disappear into grief, to collapse under the weight of what had been taken from her, to retreat into the shadows where pain could remain unseen. She was not a queen. She held no power, no authority, no influence that could change what had already been done. She could not undo the executions. She could not challenge the decision. She could not bring her sons back to life. Everything that mattered had already been taken from her, stripped away in a moment that she could not stop, could not control, could not even fully comprehend. And yet, she chose not to leave. She chose not to look away. She chose something far more difficult, far more relentless, something that would demand everything she had left. She went to where the bodies were. Not once, not for a moment, but to stay. She took a piece of sackcloth, rough and worn, a symbol of mourning, and she spread it on a rock nearby, not as a temporary place to grieve, but as a place to remain. And from that moment on, she did something no one else had the courage to do. She kept watch. At first, it may not have seemed like much, a grieving mother sitting near the bodies of her sons, refusing to leave. But time has a way of revealing the true weight of an action. And as the hours turned into days, and the days into weeks, what Ritzpah was doing became something far more powerful than anyone could have expected, because the world did not pause for her grief. The sun rose and fell. The wind carried the scent of death. The birds began to circle. They came slowly at first, cautious, testing the space, sensing that something had been left unguarded. And they would have descended, tearing into what remained, consuming what was never meant to be left exposed. But Ritzpah was there. She drove them away. Again and again. When they returned, she rose to meet them. When they circled above, she refused to move. When they descended, she fought them off, not with weapons, not with strength, but with sheer determination, with the refusal to allow what little dignity remained to be stripped away completely. And when night fell, when the darkness brought with it the sounds of animals moving through the land, drawn by the same instinct, the same hunger, she did not leave then either. She stayed. She listened. She waited. And when they came, she drove them away too. This was not a single act of courage. This was endurance. Relentless, exhausting, unending endurance. Through the heat of the day, when the sun burned without mercy, when the air itself felt heavy, pressing down on everything beneath it, she remained. Through the cold of the night, when the darkness stretched endlessly, when every sound felt amplified, when fear could have easily taken hold, she remained. Through hunger, through exhaustion, through the slow wearing down of a body that had already given so much, she remained. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, and still she remained 7 months. 7 months of standing between the living and the dead, between what had been done and what could still be preserved, between the world that had chosen to forget and a memory that refused to be erased. And in those months, something began to shift, not in the bodies, not in the land, but in the meaning of what was happening. Because what had started as punishment, as a display of power, began to transform into something else entirely, something no one had intended, a testimony, not spoken in words, not written in law, but lived, day after day, in the quiet, unyielding presence of a mother who refused to abandon what she loved. People must have heard about her. They must have passed by, seen her there, wondered how long she had been sitting, how long she intended to stay, why she had not given in, why she had not accepted what everyone else had accepted, and perhaps at first they dismissed it, saw it as grief, as madness, as something temporary that would eventually fade. But it did not fade. It grew, it deepened, it became impossible to ignore, because grief, when it refuses to be hidden, has a way of forcing the world to see what it would rather forget. And eventually, the story reached the king. David heard what Rizpah had done. He heard about the woman who would not leave, who had spent months guarding the bodies, who had stood alone against the elements, against the animals, against time itself, refusing to let the dead be dishonored. And something in that story broke through the distance between the throne and the reality of what had happened. Because kings can make decisions, kings can command actions. But sometimes, it is the quiet defiance of someone with no power that reveals the true weight of those decisions. David responded. He went and gathered the bones of Saul and Jonathan, bringing them together with the remains of those who had been left exposed, and he gave them what they had been denied from the beginning: a burial, a proper resting place, an end to the exposure, an acknowledgement that what had been done could not remain as it was. And only then, after the burial, after the act of honoring what had been left unhonored, the text tells us something subtle but significant. God responded to the land. The famine that had plagued the people came to an end, and it is here that the story reaches its most profound tension, because it forces a question that lingers long after the details have settled. What changed? Was it the passing of time? Was it the completion of justice, or was it something else entirely? Something tied to the presence of a mother who refused to let the dead be forgotten. Rizpah did not command armies. She did not speak before kings. She did not change the decree that led to the deaths. But she did something that no one else was willing to do. She stayed, and in staying, she transformed a place of punishment into a place of remembrance, a moment of abandonment into a statement of love, a silent tragedy into something that could no longer be ignored. Because sometimes, the most powerful act is not to fight, not to overthrow, not to destroy, but simply to remain when everything else is telling you to leave. Her story does not end with glory. It does not elevate her to a position of power. It does not reward her in the way stories often reward those who endure. It simply records what she did, and the effect it had, and that is what makes it so haunting. Because in a world where people often move on quickly, where tragedy is acknowledged and then forgotten, where the dead are sometimes left behind not just physically but emotionally, Rizpah stands as a contradiction to all of it. A figure who refused to allow time to erase what had happened, who refused to let silence be the final word. But not every story of loss is met with remembrance. Because there are moments when the line between what is sacred and what is forbidden is crossed in an instant, and the consequence comes just as quickly. The celebration had already begun before the mistake was made. And perhaps that is what makes the moment so unsettling, because everything felt right. Everything appeared to be moving in the direction it was always meant to go, and no one present could have imagined that within seconds, joy would collapse into fear so intense that it would stop an entire nation in its tracks. The Ark of the Covenant, the most sacred object among the people of Israel, The physical symbol of God's presence was being brought toward the city of David, and this was not a quiet movement, not a hidden transfer carried out in secrecy, but a public procession filled with music, instruments, celebration, a moment meant to mark something holy, something victorious, something deeply significant. David himself was there, not standing apart as a distant king, but fully engaged in the moment, dancing before the Lord with all his might, surrounded by people who believed they were participating in something good, something right, something that honored God. The sound of lyres and harps filled the air. Tambourines echoed across the land, and for a brief time, everything seemed aligned. Intention and action, worship and movement, purpose and execution. But intention alone has never been enough, and what unfolded next would reveal just how dangerous it can be to approach what is sacred without fully understanding what has been commanded. The ark was placed on a cart. At first glance, that detail may not seem significant, may even appear practical, a reasonable way to transport something heavy, something important, something that needed to be moved from one place to another. Oxen pulled the cart forward, steady, strong, controlled, and the procession followed, music continuing, voices raised, movement uninterrupted. But beneath the surface of what seemed efficient and orderly was a deviation, a quiet shift away from what had been instructed long before, a change that may have gone unnoticed by most, or perhaps was dismissed as unimportant, as long as the ark was moving in the right direction. And for a time, nothing happened. The cart moved, the oxen walked, the people celebrated. There was no immediate consequence, no sudden correction, no warning that what they were doing carried a risk far greater than they understood. And then, in a moment so brief it could almost be missed, everything changed. The oxen stumbled. It was not dramatic. It was not violent. Just a shift, a misstep, the kind of thing that happens without intention, without warning. Something so ordinary that no one would think twice about it under normal circumstances. But this was not normal. The cart shook, the ark shifted. And in that instant, what had been stable became uncertain. What had been secure now looked as though it might fall. And there was a man standing close enough to see it happen, close enough to react, close enough to believe that what he was about to do was not only reasonable, but necessary. His name was Uzzah. He had likely been near the ark many times before, familiar with its presence, accustomed to its significance, perhaps even comfortable in a way that blurred the line between reverence and routine. When the cart shifted, when the ark moved, when the possibility of it falling became real, his reaction was immediate, instinctive, almost unavoidable. He reached out his hand, to steady it, to protect it, to keep it from hitting the ground. There was no hesitation in that movement, no pause to consider, no time to reflect on law or command or consequence. It was the kind of action that any human being might take in that situation, a reflex born from the desire to prevent something sacred from being damaged, to stop what appeared to be a disaster in motion. And if the story ended there, if the hand touched the ark and nothing happened, it would be remembered as a moment of quick thinking, of responsibility, of care. But the moment his hand made contact, he died instantly. No struggle, no warning, no second chance. The celebration did not fade gradually. It collapsed. The music stopped. The movement halted. The energy that had filled the air just moments before was replaced by something else entirely. Something heavier, something colder, something that could not be easily explained or dismissed. Uzzah was gone, struck down in the very act that he believed was right, in the very moment he attempted to protect what was sacred. And what makes the moment so disturbing is not just the suddenness of his death, but the reason given for it, that his action, though seemingly good, crossed a line that had been clearly defined, a boundary that had not been erased simply because the intention behind the act felt justified. Fear spread quickly, because if this could happen to Uzzah, if a man could be struck down for reaching out to steady the ark, then what did that mean for everyone else standing there, for everyone who had been part of the procession, for everyone who believed they were honoring God? The question was no longer theoretical, it was immediate, it was personal, it was terrifying. David felt it too. The same man who had been dancing before the Lord, who had been leading the celebration, now found himself confronted with something he did not expect. something that disrupted not only the event but his understanding of what was happening. The text tells us that he became angry, not necessarily at Uzzah, not necessarily even at himself, but at the situation, at the reality that what had begun as a joyful act of worship had turned into something marked by death. He named the place in response to what had happened, marking it, not as a place of celebration, but as a place where something had gone wrong in a way that could not be ignored. And then he became afraid. That shift from anger to fear is significant because it reveals something deeper than confusion. It reveals a realization that what they were dealing with was not something to be approached casually, not something that could be managed or controlled through good intentions alone. "How can the ark of the Lord ever come to me?" he asked. And in that question is a recognition that the problem was not the ark itself, but the way it had been handled, the assumptions that had been made, the boundaries that had been crossed without fully understanding the consequences. So he stopped. The procession did not continue. The ark was not brought into the city. Instead, it was taken aside, placed in the house of a man named Obed-Edom, where it remained for 3 months. And during that time, something unexpected happened. The household of Obed-Edom was blessed, not harmed, not struck down, blessed. And that contrast raises another layer of tension because it shows that the presence of the ark was not inherently destructive, not something that brought death simply by being near it, but something that required a response aligned with what had been commanded, something that demanded not just sincerity but obedience. And when David heard that the house of Obed-Edom was being blessed, something shifted again, not a return to careless celebration, but a deeper understanding of what needed to be done. The ark was brought again, but this time, differently, not on a cart, not carried in a way that mirrored convenience or assumption, but according to the instructions that had been given long before, carried by those assigned to bear it, with steps measured, with sacrifices offered along the way, with an awareness that what was happening was not just movement, but reverence. But Uzzah was still dead, and that fact does not change. The correction that followed did not undo the consequence that had already taken place. And that is what makes the story linger, what makes it difficult to move past. Because it forces a confrontation with a truth that is uncomfortable, that intention does not erase instruction, that sincerity does not replace obedience, and that the line between what feels right and what is commanded can be far more dangerous than it appears. Uzzah did not reach out in rebellion. He did not act in defiance. He acted in what seemed like care, and yet it cost him his life. And that leaves us with a question that does not resolve easily, a tension that does not disappear with explanation, because it reaches into something deeper than the event itself, something that challenges the way we understand what is sacred, what is allowed, what is expected, and what happens when those lines are crossed, even for reasons that feel justified. But not all darkness comes from misunderstanding, because sometimes the most disturbing stories are not about accidents, not about missteps, but about what people choose to do to one another when there is no one left to stop them. There are wounds that bleed openly, and then there are wounds that are buried beneath silence, hidden behind walls of power, ignored not because they are unseen, but because acknowledging them would require confronting something people would rather avoid. Tamar's story is one of those wounds. It does not begin in darkness, not in a distant place or among strangers, but inside the house of a king, within a family that should have been protected, within walls that were meant to represent safety, authority, and order. She was the daughter of David, a king chosen by God, a man who had faced giants and led nations, a figure of strength and divine favor, and yet inside his own household, something began to unfold that would expose a different kind of weakness, one that could not be fought with swords or strategies, one that would not be resolved through victory on a battlefield. Amnon, her half-brother, became obsessed with her. It did not happen suddenly, not in a moment that could be easily identified and stopped, but gradually, quietly, in a way that allowed it to grow unchecked. His desire turned into something consuming, something that distorted his thinking, something that made him physically sick with longing, and yet what he felt was not love, not in any sense that carries respect or care, but something possessive, something selfish, something that viewed Tamar not as a person, but as something to be taken. And in that distortion, he found support, not from wisdom, not from someone who would correct him, but from a friend who saw his weakness and chose not to challenge it. A man who gave him a plan instead of a warning, a way to turn his desire into action without facing the consequences directly. The plan was simple, too simple. Amnon pretended to be ill, lying in bed, refusing food, drawing attention to himself until word reached King David. And when the king came to see him, concerned, unaware of what was truly happening, Amnon made a request, not something alarming, not something that would raise suspicion, but something that seemed reasonable, something that fit within the boundaries of care and family. He asked that Tamar come to him, that she prepared food in his presence, that she feed him with her own hands. And David agreed. He sent Tamar, and in that decision, without knowing it, he placed her directly into a situation she could not escape. She went, because she trusted, because she believed she was being called to care for her brother, because there was no reason, at least from her perspective, to question what had been asked of her. She entered his room, prepared the food, moved within the space, as someone who had done nothing wrong, as someone who had no reason to fear what was about to happen. But something shifted as soon as the others were sent away, as soon as the room was empty, as soon as the barrier of witnesses was removed. Amnon's true intentions surfaced, no longer hidden, no longer restrained. He told her to come closer, to lie with him, and in that moment, the truth became clear. The situation changed from something ordinary to something dangerous, something that could not be dismissed or misunderstood. She refused, not weakly, not quietly, but clearly. She spoke to him, not just to reject him, but to reason with him, to appeal to something that should have stopped him, something that should have reminded him of who he was, of who she was, of what was right and what was right and what was wrong. She told him that such a thing was not done in Israel, that it would bring disgrace, that it would destroy not only her but him as well, that there were ways to pursue what was right, that he could speak to the king, that this did not have to happen this way. She gave him every opportunity to stop, every chance to choose differently. But he did not listen, because when desire becomes obsession, reason no longer holds its place, and what follows is not a mistake, not an accident, but a decision, a crossing of a line that cannot be undone. He was stronger than her, and he used that strength not to protect, not to honor, but to take. And when it was over, everything changed, but not in the way one might expect. Because the same man who had been consumed with desire, who had believed he needed her, who had orchestrated everything to bring her into that room, now felt something entirely different. The text tells us that his hatred for her became greater than the desire he had felt before, a reversal so sharp, so sudden that it reveals the emptiness of what had driven him in the first place. It was never about her. It was about control, about possession, about satisfying something within himself that could not sustain itself once it was fulfilled. He told her to leave. She resisted, not because she wanted to stay, but because what he was doing now was another layer of wrong, another act that compounded the first, another decision that would leave her not only violated but abandoned, discarded, treated as though she were the one who had done something shameful. She told him that sending her away would be worse than what he had already done, that it would deepen the injustice, that it would leave her with no place, no protection, no restoration. But again, he did not listen. He called his servant, ordered him to throw her out, and the door was shut behind her. That door becomes more than just a physical barrier. It becomes a symbol of everything that followed, the closing off of accountability, the separation between power and consequence, the beginning of a silence that would stretch far beyond that moment. Tamar stepped out, but she did not remain silent. She tore her robe, the garment that represented her identity, her place, her purity, and she covered her head with ashes, a visible expression of grief, of devastation, of something that could not be hidden, could not be ignored. She cried out as she went, her voice carrying the weight of what had been done, not whispering, not hiding, but making it known, making it impossible for anyone who saw her to pretend that nothing had happened. And someone did hear. Absalom, her brother. He saw her, he recognized immediately what had taken place, and his response was different, not silent, not passive, but controlled, deliberate. He told her to be quiet, to come into his house, to stay with him, not because what had happened should be hidden, but because he understood something about the world they were living in, something about how power operated, how justice was not always immediate, how speaking too soon could lead to consequences that would not bring resolution. So Tamar stayed in his house, desolate. That word carries weight, not just alone, not just sad, but emptied, a life that had been interrupted in a way that could not be repaired. And what of the king? David heard, he knew, and he was angry. But anger is not the same as action. And this is where the story becomes almost unbearable, because the one person who had the authority to respond, to correct, to bring justice, did not act. There is no record of punishment, no confrontation, no resolution, only anger, and then silence. And in that silence, something began to grow, not healing, not restoration, but resentment. Absalom watched, he waited. For 2 years he did not forget, he did not forgive. And while Tamar lived in the shadow of what had been done to her, while her life remained marked by a moment she did not choose, the man who had caused it continued on, unpunished, unchanged, protected by the very system that should have held him accountable. And this is what makes the story linger. Not just the act itself, but the response to it, because sometimes the greatest injustice is not what happens in a moment, but what is allowed to continue afterward. Tamar cried out. She made her pain visible. She refused to hide what had been done. And yet, no one answered. No justice came. No restoration followed. Only time passed. And in that time, something darker was forming. Something that would eventually break the silence, not through law, not through righteousness, but through revenge. Because when justice is delayed long enough, it does not disappear, it transforms. There are moments when the line between what is sacred and what is assumed to be acceptable becomes dangerously blurred. When people stand in the presence of something holy and begin to believe that proximity is the same as permission, that being chosen is the same as being exempt, and that familiarity somehow reduces the weight of what has been commanded. Nadab and Abihu stood in that place, closer than most would ever be. Sons of Aaron, the high priest, men set apart for service, men who had witnessed things others had not seen, who had stood near the mountain when fire descended, who had eaten in the presence of God and lived. They were not outsiders. They were not ignorant. They were not distant from what was sacred. And perhaps that is what makes what happened next so unsettling, because it was not born from lack of access, but from something else entirely, something that often grows quietly in those who believe they understand what they are handling. The tabernacle stood as the center of something greater than human understanding, a place where heaven and earth seemed to meet, where instructions had been given with precision, not suggestions, not guidelines, but commands, each detail carrying meaning, each action requiring obedience. Because what was being approached was not ordinary. Fire had already come from the Lord before, consuming offerings, marking acceptance, demonstrating presence. And that fire was not something to be imitated or replaced. It was not something that could be recreated at will. It was something that belonged entirely to God. But on that day, Nadab and Abihu did something different, something small in appearance, something that could easily be overlooked if not for what followed. They took their censers, they put fire in them, they added incense, and then they offered it before the Lord. At first glance, it may seem like worship, like devotion, like participation in something sacred. The act of offering incense, the rising smoke, the symbolism of prayer, of connection, of presence. But there is a detail that changes everything, a phrase that defines the entire moment. They offered unauthorized fire, fire that had not been commanded, fire that had not been taken from the source that was prescribed, fire that represented not obedience, but assumption. And in that assumption lies something deeply human, the belief that intention can replace instruction, that creativity can step into spaces where precision was required, that what feels right can override what has been clearly said. There is no record of hesitation, no indication that they paused to consider, no suggestion that they believed they were doing something wrong. And that is what makes the moment so dangerous, because not all disobedience feels like rebellion. Sometimes it feels like worship. And then it happened. Fire came out from the presence of the Lord, not the fire they carried, but a fire that responded, a fire that consumed them instantly. The same presence that had once accepted offerings now rejected theirs in a way that could not be misunderstood, not through words, not through warning, but through action, decisive, immediate, final. Nadab and Abihu fell, consumed in the very place they believed they were serving, and the very act they believed was acceptable. And the silence that followed must have been overwhelming, because this was not distant judgment. This was not something that happened far away. This was visible, undeniable, impossible to ignore. Aaron stood there. Their father, the high priest, a man who had been given responsibility not only for himself but for his sons, for the system they served within, for the instructions that had been passed down. And in that moment, he did not cry out. He did not protest. He did not question. He remained silent because Moses spoke. This is what the Lord meant when he said, "Among those who are near me I will be proved holy in the sight of all the people. I will be honored." Those words do not soften the moment. They define it. They draw a line that cannot be blurred, cannot be negotiated, cannot be adjusted to fit human preference. Nearness to what is sacred does not reduce responsibility, it increases it. Being chosen does not remove the need for obedience, it intensifies it. And what Nadab and Abihu experienced was not random, not arbitrary, but a direct response to crossing a boundary that had been clearly established. Their bodies were carried out, removed from the camp, not buried with ceremony in that moment, not honored in a way that would comfort the family, but taken away as a reminder, as a visible consequence of something that could not be allowed to continue. And then something even more difficult was commanded. Aaron and his remaining sons were told not to mourn, not publicly, not in the way that grief demands. They were told not to tear their clothes, not to step away, not to express what must have been overwhelming inside them, because what had happened was not to be treated as an ordinary loss, but as something tied directly to the holiness of God, something that could not be reduced to personal grief without misunderstanding its meaning. This is where the tension deepens, because we are left with a father who has lost his sons, standing in a place where he cannot respond the way any father would, holding grief that cannot be expressed, processing a moment that has no easy explanation, no comforting resolution, only the reality that what has been done cannot be undone. And the question lingers, why such a severe response? Why such immediacy? Why no warning? And while explanations can be offered about holiness, about instruction, about the importance of obedience, the emotional weight of the moment does not disappear, because it confronts something that many would rather avoid, that the sacred is not something to be approached casually, not something that can be shaped according to preference, not something that adjusts itself to fit human expectation. Nadab and Abihu were not outsiders, they were not enemies, they were close, and that closeness did not protect them, it exposed them, because when you stand near what is holy, the margin for assumption disappears, and what remains is clarity, instruction, expectation, and consequence. The fire that consumed them was not just destruction, it was a declaration, a statement that what had been commanded matters, that what is given is not optional, that what is sacred is not to be redefined by those who approach it. And yet, even this is not the end of the darkness, because there are moments when judgment does not come through fire from heaven, but through something quieter, something hidden, something that looks righteous on the surface, but carries deception underneath. And when that deception is revealed, the consequence comes just as suddenly. There are moments when darkness does not arrive with violence or chaos, when it does not announce itself through noise or force, but instead slips quietly into places that appear pure, places that seem untouched, places where everything on the surface looks right. This is one of those moments. It unfolds not in the wilderness, not in the streets, not among enemies or outsiders, but within a community defined by faith, by unity, by a shared belief that had begun to reshape everything around it. People were giving freely, selling what they had, bringing the proceeds to be distributed among those in need, creating something rare, something that felt almost untouched by the selfishness that so often defines human behavior. It was a movement marked by generosity, by trust, by a sense that something new was happening, something genuine, something aligned with what it claimed to represent. And into that space came a couple, Ananias and Sapphira. They were not excluded. They were not on the outside looking in. They were part of the community, part of the same movement, part of the same environment where giving was not forced but chosen, where generosity was not commanded but embraced. And like others, they decided to sell a piece of property. On the surface, everything about that decision aligned with what was happening around them. It fit the pattern. It matched the behavior of those who were being recognized for their generosity, for their willingness to give without holding back. But something else was happening beneath the surface. Something quiet, something intentional. They agreed together to keep part of the money, not openly, not honestly, but secretly. And this is where the story shifts. Because keeping part of the money was not the problem. There was no command that required them to give everything. No rule that demanded total surrender of what they had earned. The property was theirs. The money was theirs. The choice was theirs. But instead of simply giving what they chose to give, instead of being honest about what they were offering, they decided to present it as something else entirely, to make it appear as though they had given everything, to create an image that did not match reality. It was not necessity that drove them. It was perception, the desire to be seen a certain way, to be recognized, stand among those who were admired for their sacrifice. And so Ananias brought the money. He placed it before the apostles. There was no visible hesitation, no outward sign that anything was wrong, nothing in the act itself that would immediately reveal what had been done. From the outside, it looked like generosity. It looked like participation. It looked like commitment. But then Peter spoke, not with suspicion, not with uncertainty, but with clarity. Ananias, he said, calling him by name, not addressing the act but the person. Why has Satan filled your heart to lie to the Holy Spirit? The words cut through the moment with precision, exposing what had been hidden, revealing what had been concealed, bringing into the open something that had been carefully arranged to remain unseen. And in that question, the issue becomes unmistakable. This was not about money. It was not about how much had been given or how much had been kept. It was about the decision to lie, not just to people, but to God, to create a false reality within a space that was defined by truth. Peter continued, making it clear that the property had been theirs, that the decision had always been in their control, that nothing had forced them into this position, nothing had required them to act in this way. While it remained unsold, did it not remain your own? And after it was sold, was it not at your disposal? The freedom had been there. The choice had been theirs. And yet, instead of using that freedom honestly, they had used it to construct a deception. You have not lied to man, but to God. And in that moment, the weight of what had been done is fully revealed, not in the act of keeping something back, but in the act of presenting something false as though it were true, in choosing image over integrity, appearance over reality. Ananias heard these words, and then he fell down, dead. There was no delay, no visible cause, no time for explanation, no opportunity to respond. One moment he stood, the next he was gone, and fear spread quickly, not as a reaction to violence, but as a response to something far more unsettling, the realization that what had been hidden was seen, that what had been presented outwardly could be exposed instantly, that the space they were part of was not defined only by what people could observe, but by something deeper, something that could not be deceived. The young men came. They wrapped his body, carried him out, buried him. And the moment did not end, because 3 hours later, Sapphira arrived. She did not know what had happened. She entered the same space, carrying the same story, the same version of events that had been agreed upon, the same decision that had already led to a consequence she had not yet seen. And Peter spoke to her as well, but this time, he gave her an opportunity, a moment where the truth could still be spoken, where the outcome could still be different. Tell me, he asked, is this the price you and your husband received for the land? A simple question, direct, clear, and opening. And she answered yes, she said. And in that answer the decision was repeated. The deception confirmed. The opportunity for truth passed over in favor of maintaining the appearance they had chosen. Peter responded, how is it that you have agreed together to test the Spirit of the Lord? The issue was not individual. It was shared, a decision made together, a plan carried out together, a lie sustained together. And then, the consequence that had already taken place was revealed to her, not as a warning, but as a statement of what was already done. The feet of those who buried your husband are at the door, and they will carry you out also. And immediately she fell dead, in the same place, in the same way. And the same men who had just buried her husband carried her out as well, placing her beside him. The end of a story that began not with violence, not with desperation, but with a decision to appear more than they truly were. And great fear came upon the entire church, not a passing reaction, not a momentary shock, but something deeper, something lasting, because what had happened could not be explained away as coincidence, could not be dismissed as random, could not be softened into something less severe. It stood as a clear, undeniable moment where what was hidden was exposed, where what was false was confronted, where the cost of deception within a space defined by truth was revealed in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. This was not about money, it was about integrity. It was about the alignment between what is seen and what is real. It was about the danger of constructing an identity that does not match the truth, especially in a place where truth is not optional, not flexible, not subject to personal interpretation. Ananias and Sapphira were not forced, they were not pressured, they chose. And their choice reveals something that remains deeply relevant, that the desire to be seen in a certain way can lead to decisions that compromise what is actually true, that the need for recognition can distort intention, that even in environments that are built on faith, on unity, on sincerity, the human tendency toward appearance can still find a way in, and when it does, the result is not always immediate, but in this moment, it was. And the silence that followed was not empty, it was filled with awareness, with understanding, with a recognition that what had just happened was not just a story, not just an event, but a warning, a line drawn clearly, a reminder that what is hidden is not unseen, that what is presented is not always accepted at face value, and that truth, when it is confronted, does not always come gently, because sometimes it comes all at once. There are stories people return to, and there are stories people quietly avoid, not because they are unimportant, but because they are difficult to sit with, difficult to explain, difficult to reconcile with the version of faith that feels comfortable, predictable, controlled. The stories you have just heard belong to the second kind. They do not resolve easily. They do not offer simple conclusions or clean endings. They leave something unsettled, something lingering, something that refuses to disappear even after the details fade. And perhaps that is why they are often left untold, because they challenge more than they comfort, they confront more than they reassure, and they force us to look at something deeper than surface belief. Each story reveals a different fracture. Jephthah stands as a reminder of what happens when faith is driven by desperation without understanding, when a man believes that the weight of his sacrifice will secure the favor of God, only to discover that he has bound himself to something he cannot undo. His story does not accuse God of demanding what was never commanded, but it does expose the danger of assuming that devotion justifies everything, that intensity replaces wisdom, that a vow spoken in haste must be fulfilled even when it leads to destruction. And in that silence, where no voice intervened, we are left with the reality that not every action done in the name of faith is aligned with what faith actually requires. Rizpah reveals something different, not a mistake, not a misunderstanding, but endurance, a quiet refusal to abandon what others had already left behind. She had no power to change what had happened, no authority to reverse the decision, no voice that could command attention, and yet her presence altered the outcome in a way that could not be ignored. She did not speak loudly, she did not fight violently, she stayed, and in staying she forced a king to see what had been overlooked, to respond to what had been ignored, to restore dignity to what had been denied. Her story does not remove the tragedy, but it transforms the meaning of it, showing that even in loss there can be a response that refuses to let darkness have the final word. Uzzah's moment is brief, but it cuts sharply. A single action, a single touch, a single consequence. And yet within that moment lies a tension that is difficult to resolve. The gap between intention and obedience. The realization that what feels right is not always what has been commanded. That proximity to what is sacred does not grant permission to act outside of what has been defined. His story does not suggest that care is wrong, but it does reveal that sincerity alone is not enough, that reverence requires more than instinct, that the sacred is not something to be handled casually, even with the best of intentions. Then there is the night where everything collapsed, where protection turned into betrayal, where a man chose himself over the one who trusted him, where a crowd became something unrecognizable. That story does not allow distance. It does not create space for comfort. It exposes what happens when there is no restraint, no accountability, no boundary left to hold back what is already present beneath the surface. And perhaps what makes it most disturbing is not just what the crowd did, but what was allowed to happen, what was negotiated, what was sacrificed in the name of survival. It forces a question that does not fade easily. What are people capable of when nothing stands in the way? Tamar's story echoes with a different kind of pain, not public chaos but private injustice. A violation followed not by restoration but by silence. She cried out, she made her suffering visible. She refused to hide what had been done. And yet, the response that should have followed did not come. Authority heard, and did nothing. And in that silence something began to grow, something that would not remain contained, something that would eventually erupt, not as justice, but as revenge. Her story does not end with healing, and that absence forces us to confront a reality that is often overlooked, that injustice is not always corrected when it happens, that sometimes it lingers, shaping everything that follows. Nadab and Abihu stand in a different light, not as victims, but as those who crossed the line they believed, they understood, they were close, chosen, set apart, and still, they acted outside of what had been commanded. Their story removes the illusion that familiarity with what is sacred reduces its weight. It does not. It intensifies it. And the fire that consumed them becomes more than a moment of judgment. It becomes a declaration that what is holy is not subject to human adjustment, not something that can be reshaped according to preference or creativity. And then Ananias and Sapphira, a story that unfolds quietly, without violence, without force, without external pressure, and yet ends just as suddenly as any of the others. Their sin was not in what they kept, but in what they claimed. In the gap between appearance and truth, in the decision to construct an image that did not match reality. And their story reveals something that is perhaps the most subtle and therefore the most dangerous, that deception does not always look like rebellion, that it can exist within generosity, within participation, within environments that appear pure, and that when it is confronted, the consequence can be immediate and undeniable. These stories are different. Different settings, different people, different moments, and yet they are connected, not by a single theme that simplifies them, but by something deeper, something that runs beneath each one, something that cannot be ignored once it is seen, the weight of human choice, the reality of consequence, the tension between what is intended and what is actually done. Some of these people believed they were doing what was right. Some knew exactly what they were doing. Some were victims, some were responsible. And yet none of the stories allow us to separate ourselves completely, to stand at a distance and say that this belongs only to them, because within each one is a reflection of something that still exists, something that has not disappeared, something that continues in different forms, in different contexts, in different lives. We prefer the stories that resolve cleanly, the ones where justice is immediate, where the good are rewarded, where the wrong is corrected without delay. But these are not those stories. These are the ones that remain unresolved, that leave questions unanswered, that force us to sit in discomfort. And perhaps that is exactly why they matter, because they do not allow faith to remain shallow. They do not allow belief to exist without depth. They do not allow the sacred to be reduced to something easy, something predictable, something that fits neatly within expectation. They confront, they challenge, they expose, and in doing so, they leave a choice. Not the kind of choice that appears dramatic or immediate, but the kind that unfolds slowly, quietly, in the way we think, the way we act, the way we respond when faced with moments that echo even faintly, the same tensions these stories reveal. Because the truth is, these stories are not just about the past, they are about patterns, about tendencies, about decisions that still happen, in different forms, in different ways, often unnoticed until the consequence arrives. And when it does not always come with warning. It does not always give time to adjust. Sometimes it simply reveals what was already there. And that is what makes these stories so difficult to forget. Not because they are dark, but because they are honest, and honesty, especially when it confronts what we would rather avoid, has a way of staying with us long after the story ends.